What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you good arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today we're going to be looking at a video that claims that Darwinism is an integral part of new atheism, which, if you guys don't know, Darwinism, or science in general, is completely separate from the question of whether or not a God exists, which is what atheism deals with. But anyways, here's a look at what we're getting into today.
However, I would argue that they know in their own minds, if they accept that evolution is not a 100% proven beyond all doubt fact, and everything they have proclaimed to the world, all the arguments they have made, all the people whose intelligence they have insulted and accused of having no real understanding, it's going to be immediately seen for what it truly is. Nothing but a facade of false confidence.
If you're interested in a response to this video, then please stay tuned.
So the more I take part in debates and listen to the new atheist arguments against believing in God, the more I've noticed that Darwinian evolution is central to their positions.
It's not really central to my position as to whether or not a God exists. I actually didn't consider evolution when trying to determine whether or not a God exists. I eventually came into the anti-creationist community, and I found that people were actually pushing for like a 6,000-year-old Earth despite all of the evidence. And so that's where Darwinism kind of kicked in for me. But that's not the experience of all atheists. There are plenty of atheists out there who began questioning their religion because they were fundamentalist Christians who believed in a 6,000-year-old Earth and then found the science that shows that that's incorrect. And that made them start questioning their religion, what they're taught, and every belief that they held concerning their God. And that's a perfectly fine way. There's no reason to disparage any particular person's path to whatever current beliefs that they have.
It's actually pretty obvious if you pay attention and realize how, from their perspective, God not being required for life to exist enables them to dismiss any other evidence that he does.
I wouldn't say that it allows me to dismiss every other evidence that he does exist. I feel like each individual piece of evidence I've been able to analyze and come to my own conclusion on it. Evolution or Darwinism or how life got here, none of that really factored in to my decisions on any one piece of evidence, unless it directly concerns those things. One thing that I want to point out here at the very beginning is that you can believe in God and also accept evolution as a fact. Evolution being a fact has no effect whatsoever on whether or not God exists.
Fine-tuned universe? Nope. We're just animals and couldn't know. We're not smart enough to know if something was actually designed. Our genetic code requires an intelligent agent in order for it to exist? Nah, it's just chemical reactions.
So for one thing, we are just animals. We're part of the animal kingdom. Taxonomically, it's correct to say that we are animals. Biologically, it's correct to say that we are animals. And in reality, we are animals. Now, that's not to say that we are exactly like other animals. Obviously, we're different. We have higher functioning central nervous systems that allow us to develop like a sense of morality. It allows us to rationalize certain things. It basically just allows complex thought, which includes those two previous examples. DNA is not a code. I hear this from creationists all the time. It's not a code. We can interpret it as a code, and we can use that in order to determine certain effects that changing the chemical composition of DNA would cause, but it is not a code. It's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It's an acid. I don't understand why you think it's a code. DNA is no more of a code than Diet Coke and regular Coke.
The laws of logic and nature need a first cause? Get out of here. Every aspect of religion made it by primitive humans who weren't as enlightened as us.
The laws of logic are a human description of things that we observe in reality. Now, while these laws of logic, I would say, are pretty solid in being able to represent reality, they're still just a human description of our experience of reality. So yeah, given that humans are the ones that develop the laws of logic because of our experiences, I would say that we did not need an intelligent designer, like overall intelligent designer, to create them. Well, I would say that primitive humans definitely developed religious ideas, and religion has gone back to primitive times. A lot of modern Christianity is still stuck in a primitive state, especially creationism.
Objective morality? Get real, it's all just subjective.
Morality is subjective. The fact that in Christianity, one of the many religions that claims to have the objective truth or objective moral code has changed its own moral code throughout history. So you can't really say that you have the objective or absolute moral code when it regularly changes depending on what society deems to be morally good or bad. Maybe, you should stick with the original intent of your Bible and see how far that gets you.
God doesn't exist, so we aren't accountable to anything except what society thinks is the moral in the here and now. Any level of existence beyond this physical life? Not a chance.
We don't have any evidence for any kind of physical existence beyond this life, or any kind of existence beyond this life. So yeah, I would say that we are held accountable to the society that we live in. Generally, humans will conform to whatever society that they are in.
Now, as you dig a little deeper and listen to former believers, now atheist activists, talk about how they lost their faith, almost to a person, you will hear something very similar. I went to college, learned about evolution, realized the Bible was wrong, talked to some folks in church, and none of them could answer my questions. And that is what led to me realizing religion was fake, and now they're an atheist trying to save other people from a God who they claim does not exist.
I disagree with this hypothetical situation of somebody going to college, learning more things than their pastor taught them, and then leaving their religion, and now they're trying to turn people away from religion. I guess he would see people arguing with other people on the internet as like trying to convince them to leave their religion. But that's really not what we're doing. I mean, people argue about things all the time. I think that more people out there need to be okay with not being able to convince people that they're talking to. But in general, we're not really trying to make you leave your God. We're just pointing out how illogical your thought process is when it comes to religion specifically. Now, I will say that the more educated you become, the more likely it is for you to leave your religion, or at least change your relationship to religion. Not everybody that goes to college comes away an atheist like he's trying to make it out to be. Also, the path people take to get to atheism doesn't always include evolution. Sometimes it includes other philosophical concepts that are in no way connected to evolution. I really disagree with his broad brush approach when talking about how atheists became atheists.
This leads to a worldview that death and destruction is caused not by the sinful nature of humanity that is in need of salvation, but because of chance and chaos. There is no ultimate purpose for our existence, and free will, that's just a fantasy.
Now, I don't think that free will is an actual thing. I think that we have a faux sense of free will in that we really have just freedom of choice, which is completely different than free will. He also mentions here the whole death and destruction thing, and especially after Jesus came and supposedly provided salvation, you have a lot of Christian crusades and Christians causing a lot of havoc. I mean, there were even points in time where Christians were killing Christians because they weren't worshiping their God the most Christian way that they felt you could worship their God. The whole Catholic versus Protestant thing was, I mean, a pretty big deal in history. For you to say that it's because of our sinful nature that this whole death and destruction thing is going on just seems to be a guilt tactic employed by religion, or specifically your Christian religion, to get you to feel bad about even being human. And And I totally disagree with that kind of theology. You see it all over the place in, these fundamentalist type of groups that, you are sinful and horrible just because you're human in general, and that all of the world's problems are caused by your sin or man's sin in general. In reality, we have natural explanations for why bad shit happens, and so we don't need an intelligent designer or some kind of god figure in order to explain why bad shit happens. We definitely don't need somebody that's going to blame us when we have nothing to do with some of the natural shit that goes on. We're definitely to blame for like climate change and how fast that's happening, and a lot of the weather related stuff and everything like that. Like, we're definitely have a hand in that, but I'm just, what I'm talking about.
Everything is materialistic, and there is nothing that it cannot be explained by natural causes.
Oh shit. he predicted exactly what I was going to say. Damn it.
Now let's bring this back to Darwinian evolution and think for a second. What is the root argument? Natural selection replaces the need for an intelligent agent. Therefore, we do not need God in order to exist.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that's the argument. Like, I don't know anybody that uses that particular argument. For one thing, natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution can occur. There are different types of selection out there, like sexual selection, and there's even artificial selection. A good example of that is dogs. What you're talking about here is natural selection being a mechanism that doesn't replace the need for a god. Like I said before, you can accept evolution as the fact that it is, and you can still believe in God. Evolution being a thing does not negate the possibility of a God existing. If anybody is out there using evolution as an argument against God in general, then you're using it wrong. If you want to use evolution as proof that the Bible, a fundamentalist view of the Bible, a creationist view of the Bible, is incorrect, then that is the proper way to argue against a fundamentalist view of that particular version of Christianity. His broad brush thing here really leaves him open to a lot of different possibilities, but in general, evolution's not an argument against God existing.
If a higher power is required for life to exist, and it is neither logical, plausible, or probable that we could be here without its existence, then it is more reasonable to conclude that what appears to be designed is designed, and therefore God must exist.
So, I mean, he's just restating the whole argument from design thing. And he's assuming that because things look designed and he's presupposing that God exists, like, oh, if there is a God, then the possibility of everything being designed is 100%. Therefore, because everything looks designed, that means God exists. And that's really a poor way to argue it. For one thing, the argument from design is a poor argument to begin with. I don't know if everybody's screaming about puddles, but, there's the whole parable of the puddle. Basically, just because something looks designed or seems designed does not necessarily mean that it is designed. And what this guy is doing is presupposing that a God exists, and that explains why everything seems designed. But just because it seems designed to us doesn't mean that it's actually designed. A better test for whether or not it was designed is if we have a natural process to explain why it looks a certain way or functions a certain way. If we can find a natural explanation for that, then we don't need a God in order to explain it. We don't need some supernatural explanation because it's already explained naturally. You starting off from the position that God definitely exists and then extrapolating from that point is a very disingenuous way to argue for the existence of God.
If life could not exist without a higher power, then it would be logical to conclude all of the logic rules and laws of nature, mathematics, all those things that enable us to exist would also need a higher power.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that the mathematical proofs or laws or the laws of logic allow us to exist. I would say the things that allow us to exist are the physics of this universe. Just because the physics of this universe work out for life in this universe, that doesn't mean that some other kind of configuration can't exist where life can also arise. A lot of people like to use this as the fine-tuning argument, which I think is kind of, know where he's going with it, because normally the fine-tuning argument's used in conjunction with the argument from design. What you definitely can't establish is that this universe is the only kind of universe that can support life. There's no way to determine whether or not the fine-tuned properties are actually fine-tuned, or if they can exist in some other kind of configuration that would allow for life to exist. And that's what he's totally ignoring here in this argument.
If our universe can only exist because of those laws, then a higher power must also exist.
But you see, we don't need a higher power for the laws of logic or math. Math is a human description of our reality. Laws of logic is also a human description, even if you want to consider them to be as solid as anything can be. It's still a human description of the laws of logic and are therefore possibly flawed. He's presupposing that a God needs to exist in order for the laws of logic, math, physics, and all that even to exist. So he's a presuppositionalist. He's starting from the position that God definitely exists, and then he's ad hoc extrapolating from that point and claiming things are evidence when they're not really evidence.
If God exists, then perhaps there is more to our existence than what we see just in this life. Perhaps we will be held to a higher standard. Maybe I will be held accountable for my actions. And oh my, what if I am completely wrong?
I would say that's a possibility, that you could still be held to some kind of higher standard after this life. We don't know what happens after we die, and there's no way we're ever going to know what happens after we die. I think that nothing happens and we fade off into non-existence. But I will say that the Christian idea of justice after this life is inherently flawed, because basically all you have to do is worship God enough or believe in the correct version of God, and then you get absolved of your sins. As long as you believe in Jesus, then you get through those pearly gates. You could do anything in this world and you'll be forgiven if you just believe in Jesus. And that's not really justice. I mean, when you have a cop-out as easily to maneuver as that, are you really getting any kind of justice?
These are questions that every human must ask themselves at some point in life. What the answers mean to how we conduct our lives is why atheists deride things like Pascal's wager, which is, who has the more to lose? The person who believes in God, and it turns out there's nothing after this life, or the one who believes there is no God, only to find out after death that he does?
Well, the problem with Pascal's wager is the fact that you're assuming that the Christian version of God is the only kind of God that can exist. But since we don't know which version of God exists, let alone which version of the Christian God exists, then you have to leave yourself open to the many different interpretations of God. And so basically, if you take the big three religions, if you don't worship those gods in a specific way so that it makes them happy, then you're going to hell. So it's not really atheism versus Christianity or this some kind of deistic God, because if it's a deistic God, then you're not going to be sent to hell. He doesn't give a fuck what you do, right? So you're going to have these very specific descriptions of God that send you to hell if you don't worship them or do things in a certain way, right? So it's really atheism versus all of those other descriptions of it. And whatever version of Christianity you have is only one particular fraction of that entire theistic 50%. If you really wanted to look at it statistically, then atheism would definitely come out on top versus any one specific version of God that exists.
Now, I'm not suggesting that you should decide to believe in God solely out of fear of being wrong or fear of hellfire and brimstone.
Really, because that's exactly what Pascal's wager was meant to do, persuade people through fear. And then also, that's a lot of the Christian theology is like, hey, do you want to go to hell and burn there and have Satan shove pineapples up your ass all the time? Huh? You want to have that happen? No, then you better believe in Jesus and suck that Jesus dick. Like, that's a common thing for, I don't know where you're trying to act like fear-mongering is not a prime component of Christianity.
What I'm saying is the reality of there being a 50-50 chance God does exist is not something that should be taken, well, lightly.
I mean, I agree. I don't think it should be taken lightly, but I also don't think that I've come to my position lightly. I think everybody should critically examine what they believe and why they believe those things. And it should be a continual process to continue to figure out what you believe so that it's actually you that has come to that decision as to what you believe, and not let somebody else persuade you into that position, even though you haven't critically considered it.
However, as dogmatic belief in evolution has taken over academia, and as atheists love to claim it is an accepted fact by 99% of scientists, they now have the ability to dismiss all other arguments. They can then accuse theists of being uneducated, unenlightened primitives who just believe in a God of the gaps for all things that seem to be beyond the natural world.
Well, no, it's not theist, it's creationists. Not all theists believe in a creationist God. You happen to believe in a creationist God, so fundamental creationism in America, I would say, definitely you're ignorant of the science behind everything that proves your particular version of religion to be wrong. This is not a grand statement against theism or Christianity in general. It's just a statement against creationism. Also, he's negating the fact that there are theistic evolutionists out there that believe that God still created everything, but that he created it a long time ago and that evolution is a thing.
By removing the need for God in order for life to exist, they can now completely dismiss these questions and at least act like they are just used to scare people.
I don't think the questions that you've raised here are used to scare people. I think like the Pascal's wager, the threatening people with hell, that scares people. And that's scaring people into believing in your particular version of Christianity. But I would not say that any of the questions that you posed here, as far as like the laws of logic and the origin of life and all that, I really don't see the fear tactic in those particular questions.
Religion of any kind is now easily defined as just a method to control people like sheep.
Well, yeah, religion is definitely, used as a control method. But I mean, I think that there are plenty of control methods out there. Society in general is a control method. I don't think that Christianity being a control method necessarily makes it bad, but it's the control that it tries to exert on people that believe in the religion that is bad.
This brings me to what my next video will explain in much more detail, and that is the genetic code, and more importantly, the information it contains. Atheists desperately attempt to avoid the premise that it actually contains real information and is not just purely deterministic chemical reactions.
I mean, it is just chemical reactions. Like I said at the beginning of this, DNA can be interpreted as a code, but that does not make it inherently a code. We can determine certain sequences, and we can know the effect of those sequences on the rest of the organism, or on certain biomechanical operations or chemical interactions within an organism. Like, we can determine those things. Just because we can determine sequences in DNA does not mean that it inherently contains code, though.
The reason for this is if it actually is a programming code base, then it is an unavoidable conclusion that a higher power and an intelligent designer must have caused it to come into existence.
It doesn't necessarily entail that, though. Like, even if you were to assume, like, oh, this is a code base or whatever the fuck, I don't think that it necessarily entails that an intelligent designer had to do it. I think that there could possibly be natural explanations for why it seems that way, but we're always going to be restricted by our own human experience. Also, this is another concept of, like, presuppositionalists, to presuppose that it is a code base and therefore that means God exists.
In the information age we currently enjoy, to me it's a completely implausible concept to conclude that HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, WordPress, apps, or any of the other aspects of technology that utilize software, that they could possibly come into existence without programmers and designers being required.
I agree, that would be crazy to assert, but luckily that's not what we're asserting. That's not what anybody's asserting here. It's only you that's claiming that evolution would entail this. So you're basically building a straw man argument against people that already accept evolution and are misrepresenting their arguments for evolution. You see, the biggest difference here is that we have natural explanations for like why DNA looks the way that it does, why it operates the way that it does, and why the diversity of life that we have here on Earth exists. We have natural explanations for why these things happen. We don't have explanation for why, like, PHP exists, other than somebody designed it. So what you're really doing here is you're comparing bananas to horses here.
Now, since the majority of millennials, and for sure pretty much everybody coming after the millennial generation, they've got some basic understanding of code and how it works, even if it's just on a purely intellectual level. Therefore, atheists must desperately attempt to avoid this comparison. I would say there's not a mildly intelligent person on this planet who would ever conclude that their WordPress site could magically pop into existence, nor would they ever conclude that the WordPress content management system could possibly have come into existence, even if you gave it infinite amount of time and an infinite number of universes to work with, without there being an intelligent agent behind it.
Well, yeah, I would say that would be crazy to expect, but luckily nobody's expecting this except for creationists.
There's just no logical, plausible, and probable conclusion you can reach that says binary code will magically transform into syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and all the other if, then, and else logic rules that are required for any type of programming to actually work.
And again, the only people that have ever mentioned this or ever said this or ever expect this are creationists, just like you.
But all those things exist in our genetic code, and it is an accepted premise that this code is absolutely required for any form of life to function, let alone reproduce.
But it doesn't exist in our code. Like, our code doesn't have if this then that kind of statements in it. Sure, there are certain genes that if they're turned off, then other genes don't function. That's an effect of it, and the way that we interpret the effect of that one gene or marker or something like that, the way that we interpret that is in an if then that kind of way. But that doesn't mean that the DNA literally says that. It's our interpretation of how it works.
Beyond that, we have absolutely no idea how it could possibly come into existence purely by chance chemical reactions billions of years ago, let alone develop over time into the organized systems that we call life.
You see, right here, you're just ignorant of current science. For one thing, the Michelson-Morley experiment, which I've covered before, it showed that how organic compounds can definitely develop out of inorganic compounds. That's one particular step in abiogenesis, which is what you're talking about. And then we have other experiments out there that show how they can self-order and how the RNA, the whole RNA world theory, how RNA, self-replicating RNA, it would eventually develop into DNA. There's a natural path between inorganic chemicals and life. Because we don't have every single piece within that path doesn't mean that we can't connect the dots. If I gave you a drawing that's a connect the dots thing, you don't need every single little point in the path in order to draw a path. And that's exactly what we've done with abiogenesis. Just because we don't have an ultra fine-tuned path to follow doesn't mean that we can see like the path that it's taking. And the path that it's taking doesn't require a God in order for organic materials to form or life.
Atheists attempt to avoid this by quickly shifting back to accusations of God of the gaps, and how anybody who believes it couldn't have happened by chance is just blinded by religion.
No, I wouldn't say that they're blinded by religion. I would say that they're blinded by the ignorance towards evolution. I think that religious people can definitely educate themselves into a theistic evolution sort of position. And I'm perfectly fine with people that want to think that God is the one that started evolution, or however they want to explain their ideas of God and evolution. Perfectly fine with it. I have no issue. My issue with the existence of God is outside of the realm of evolution.
However, I would argue that they know in their own minds, if they accept that evolution is not a 100% proven beyond all doubt fact, then everything they have proclaimed to the world, all the arguments they have made, all the people whose intelligence they have insulted and accused of having no real understanding, it's going to be immediately seen for what it truly is. Nothing but a facade of false confidence.
I don't really feel like I have a facade of false confidence, considering that I also have theists on my side that accept evolution for the fact that it is, and we're perfectly fine coexisting in this particular space. But also you're highlighting your ignorance of how to critically think about your positions. Because what you would need to do in order to really convince anybody is to disprove any particular aspect of evolution and show how it can't have possibly happened. That is the way to make your point here. All you did was make claims that, well, everything looks designed, and if there was a God, then everything would look designed, so therefore God exists. And that's not really the best way to argue that position. I think that you need to prove how my position is faulty and doesn't explain everything, or doesn't explain a certain point. But even then, if I don't have a good explanation for it right now, it doesn't necessarily entail that your God exists. All you've really done is proven how my explanation is insufficient and I need to rework it, do more research on it, or do more experiments to fill in those gaps, or possibly change my theory in order to make it fit with reality. Like, just because you say any one particular thing about evolution does not mean that your God exists.
Then their attempt to escape the overwhelming evidence that God does exist will immediately collapse, and that is something they just cannot bring themselves to accept.
What evidence? I have yet to see this evidence. I would really enjoy looking at this evidence that is so overwhelming. If it's the same regurgitated shit that I've heard from other apologists out there, then you ain't got anything new for me to look at. I've already examined this evidence, like the argument from design, the teleological argument, the Pascal's wager. Like I've looked at all of these things, and just because you're easily convinced of your position doesn't mean that I necessarily have to be easily convinced.
As you think about what has been covered in this video, go watch some of the videos made by these activists and truly consider the foundation of their worldview. Look past their fancy language and philosophical arguments and truly consider if what they are saying is ultimately founded upon God not being required for life to exist.
Well, I mean, yeah, there hasn't been anything to prove that God is necessary for life to exist. And us regurgitating facts that continuously reestablish the fact that natural processes don't need a creator or anything like that, it doesn't mean that we're somehow dubious in our position. I mean, it's not our fault that the natural world doesn't require a God to exist. Thank you, heathens, for taking your time out today to listen to the same shit that you've heard time and time again. If you will, please go down below, leave me a comment with what you thought about this guy's arguments in his presentation. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Hey, while you're at it, why don't you join the Skeptic Mafia? We're a pretty cool bunch. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.